Our first tipping point tonight, what has our country come to, where liberals are more infuriated that President Trump hasn't released his tax returns than they are by the fact that our government wastes billions of our hard-earned tax dollars every single year. Across the country this weekend, liberals and progressives marched. The Tax Day March, they called it. It was sponsored, partially at least, by the Democratic Party. Only it wasn't the kind of tax march we've seen historically in America. This was no Boston Tea Party. This was not a protest against high taxes. This was not a protest against government abuse. This was not a protest against taxation without representation. No. These liberals angrily took to the streets, marching and yelling, upset not about their own paychecks growing slimmer, but angry because President Trump hasn't released his tax returns. Take a look.
What do we want? No representation without taxation! No representation without taxation! Surrender Donald! Surrender Donald! Surrender Donald!
The only way to really
actually like Bin Laden
penetrate this administration is to take to the streets and to be relentless.
Joining me now, hosts of the Andrea Kaye radio show, Andrea Kaye, and Democratic strategist Kevin Walling. Andrea, Kevin, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
Good evening, Liz.
All right, Andrea, let me start with you first. And this is a bit of a rhetorical question, I'll admit, right from the start. Andrea, what has our country come to? We used to protest taxation without representation, high taxes, abuse of government, and now people are more upset about the fact that President Trump didn't release his tax returns than they are about all the money that the government wastes every year.
Yeah, it's kind of shocking, isn't it? Because it's kind of not really about what this country was all about and at its founding. But how did we get here? Well, we got here because we've had decades now of the left indoctrinating our youth through taking over the education system as well as the mainstream media, teaching them to demonize success, demonize successful people like Donald Trump, corporations, business owners, demonizing our own country, its free market capitalist system, demonizing limited government through low taxation. And most of these people are some of the same people that were at general election rallies or primary rallies for the Democrats. 20,000 of them at these Bernie Sanders rallies chanting for free stuff when there's no such thing as free, because these people don't even understand the basics of economics, that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Nothing is free. There is no government money. And, they don't seem to get it. None of these people, I think, would even know what these tax returns even said if they even got their hands on it.
Right, and Kevin, let me ask you, explain this to me if you understand this. These protests, like I said, were partially sponsored by the Democratic Party, but how is the fact that Donald Trump hasn't released his tax returns, how is that more important to these people? It's the impetus for them to turn out to march in the streets. How is that more important than the fact that, we're $20 trillion in debt?
Yeah, Liz, I think it's important to point out that this just wasn't an isolated march in one city. There were 150 marches in the streets. I think it's important to realize that over 80% of Americans, 64% of Republican voters want to see the president's tax returns. This is something that goes back to Richard Nixon when he ran for president for the first time, that presidents and candidates for presidents have always released them. The president even said in 2001 and again in 2016 that he would release those returns. And I think it's important with this White House that is under FBI investigation for Russian connections to the campaign to go ahead and release this information to the public. So
right,
that we can
I get the argument. I get the argument that you're
forward.
making. I mean, you say 150 marches in the street. You're basically saying people care about this. You're saying the overwhelming majority of Americans care about this. But Kevin, if people cared about this, would they have voted for Trump in the first place?
Well, again, 3 million more people voted for the other candidate in this election. We don't need to, of course, rehash that. So the majority of Americans were not in favor of this president. But I think, spending is out of control, and both parties can agree to that. But I think one of the catalysts for that is the $3.6 million every time President Trump goes on a golf vacation to Mar-a-Lago. Hardworking Americans who have not taken a vacation maybe in years that are struggling to make ends meet to the tune of $4 million, again, every weekend when the president goes to his private club, 7 weekends of the last 13 in office. So government spending is out of control, and the president is leading that charge in that direction.
Right, and Andrea, go ahead and talk to this for a minute, because this is what I don't understand. Wasteful government spending. I mean, like I said, $20 trillion. If you divide that among every American in this country, something like $165,000 that each and every person in this country owe. Yet Democrats now are criticizing Trump. Kevin, you just said you're criticizing Trump for going to his private retreat every weekend, which is fairly typical of presidents, Republican or Democrat. But we haven't heard anything the past 8 years when President Obama more than doubled our national debt. We didn't hear anything from them about wasteful spending.
Is that for me?
Yeah, that's for you, Andrea.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. It's funny to me how I actually think the left kind of has somewhat of a good argument in terms of the vacation expenses, because I complained about that for 8 years with President Obama. $10 million, I think it was, and maybe even more, they spent just on vacations when George W. Bush went to his ranch. But, you know, that's the only thing that I think some Republicans and Democrats might agree on with increased spending. Where has the Democrat Party been for the last 8 years in regards to the egregious government waste and spending all across our government? And in fact, just in the past few weeks, as in the first 100 days of Trump's presidency, when he's done some executive orders to roll back, government a little bit, they're freaking out because the left doesn't seem to have a problem with $20 trillion. And I don't care whether this was one town or 150 towns. These people are out there protesting because they want to see his tax returns. They're not protesting about spending. And oh, by the way, when Rachel Maddow did her Geraldo's Vault and did that whole evening on his tax returns, what did we find out? That he paid more taxes than Bernie Sanders did. So, you know, the left needs to truly actually get on board and not get. And by the way, can we finally put to bed this Trump collusion story? Because they're going to this tax thing now because that failed. So I think maybe we can all move ahead on that.
Right, and Kevin, let me turn to you for just a second, because I actually don't want to pivot away from Trump's tax returns. I think a lot of conservatives tend to do that. They tend to address the elephant in the room for just one moment before dismissing it and moving on. I don't want to do that. I want to talk about this because I want to ask you, why aren't Democrats satisfied? I mean, the Rachel Maddow tax return reveal, it was underwhelming. It was ridiculous. I think most people, Democrats and Republicans, can agree on that. But it did tell us one very important thing, that 2005, the 2 pages of the 2005 tax return, we found out that Donald Trump paid $38 million in taxes on $150 million in income. That's a 25% tax rate. And it is, like Andrea said, that's higher than President Obama's tax rate and Bernie Sanders' tax rate. I mean, we have no indication that President Trump, before he was president, abused his taxes in any way. Why doesn't that satisfy the left?
Because we haven't seen him, Liz. You know, that tax return that you talked about on Rachel Maddow was from 2005. That's 12 years ago. And in that time, you know, businesses have changed. We don't know any kind of dealings that he's had with foreign governments over those years. So it's important to clear the air, again, especially before this president, after the disaster that healthcare reform was, wants to move on to tax reform. Let's see how tax reform is going to benefit this president. He's an able businessman, I'll grant you that. Let's get that out in the air in terms of what is going on with his personal finances. And to Andrea's point before, where have the Democrats been the last 8 years? President Obama cut the deficit by 2/3 from 2009 when he assumed office until he turned the reins over to President Trump. So this was an administration that focused solely on economic stability over those 8 years and leaving this country better off than they found it from George W. Bush.
Right. I mean, I don't think the majority of Americans agree that they're better off after Obama than they were when he took office. In fact, all the polls showed that to be otherwise, but it's mind-blowing to me. We are at a time here, unfortunately. But the final point that I want to make, it's mind-blowing to me that all these people, these 150 protests that you talk about, they turned out in the streets so angry about President Trump's tax returns, even though we have no indication that there was any wrongdoing whatsoever. It's simply precedent that he chose not to follow. And they're more angry about that than being $20 trillion in debt, or the fact that we have to work until April 24th every single year in order to pay off the taxes from the last year. 30% of income in America is paid to the federal and state and local governments in taxes. That doesn't seem to bother liberals. But Andrea, Kevin, we're out of time. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks for having me.